O wszystko. Okay, so we will continue our discussion about the famous alliance or pact, non-aggression pact, USSR and the Germany. And last time we spoke about the Poland, about the intervention of the Soviet army in the eastern Poland after 17 September. And today I would like to listen your speech about the speech of the Professor Bruno Drweski. What's happened? What was the relation between the Baltic states and the Soviet Union in the time 1939, 1941?
Yes. Well, first of all, we have to take into account that after the Russian Revolution and the creation of these three states, Soviet Union recognized the independence of these states after moments when you had their civil wars between local communists and let's say nationalists, but also you had a war in Estonia and Latvia between local communists and between German, let's say paramilitary forces in Latvia and Estonia, allied with white Russians. And in the south, in Lithuania, you had also fights with white Russians. You had fight with German army and later with Polish army. And at the very end of this process, when Communist Russia, Soviet Russia was concentrated on civil war, at the very end, the independence of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia was recognized by Soviet Russia as a, let's say, better choice than, of course, the German colonists or the Polish expansionism, not, of course, talking about white Russians. And this situation prevailed during the whole interwar period. And I would say it would have prevailed later if the general situation wouldn't have changed. It means the Second World War. And of course, because of the Second World War, when Germany attacked Poland, the whole situation changed. The whole geostrategical situation changed. And then it became very important for Soviet Union to take control of territories which were very important from the strategical point of view of Soviet Union. As we saw, of course, what was earlier the Eastern Poland was very important, but the Baltic states and Finland were also very important because they were very near from centers of Soviet Union, and especially very near with the port of Leningrad. And this geostrategical situation explains why Soviet Union, taking into account the German-Soviet non-aggression pact, concentrated on those territories which were of basic importance for Soviet army, Soviet strategical situation. That's one point, and of course it will explain the later evolution. But this evolution will take a little bit time because first Soviet Union will change the border with former Poland. Then Soviet Union will claim the territory they did never recognized as Romanian of Bessarabia, what is called today Moldavia. or Eastern Moldavia, and later they will concentrate on Baltic states and Finnish borders. And we see there is a logical policy of intervention of Soviet Union in these states. But we have, of course, to take into account that after the beginning of the Second World War, Baltic states were still independent up to June 1940. It means that Soviet Union at the beginning began with the situation that it only asked these states to cooperate militarily with Soviet Union, but not taking any further steps toward the integration of these states to Soviet Union. Even we can say better, when they occupied the Polish city and the Polish area of Vilno, which was the Polish name of that area, they very quickly gave this territory and the city, of course, to Lithuania, because Lithuania was asking this territory from the very beginning of its independence. And from the period going from October 1939 up to June 1940, Vilno became Vilnius and became Lithuanian due to Soviet intervention. So we see that Soviet Union took into account let's say the traditional claim of Lithuania against Poland for its former historical capital, which was this city. And it shows that the main purpose of Soviet policy then was strategical and not really political at that time. As soon as the situation became more and more tense in Europe due to the war, then we saw a much more active policy of Soviet Union in the Baltic states. It means in June 1940, what we have to take into account, then June 1940 is the same month when German troops were entering France and Belgium, but especially France, and the whole general strategical situation in Europe, and especially the strength of the Third Reich, became so important that Soviet Union had to take steps, strategically speaking, to show that it is a state controlling an area which is of basic importance, and it will not accept any compromise with Germany on its that would be against the balance of power in Europe. And we have to take that into account, that the Baltic states were reunited, or were taken became part of Soviet Union under this situation, under this general geostrategical situation after the collapse of France. So it means more or less 1 year after the beginning of the Second World War. That's, of course, this situation we have to take into account. And we can also say that for the Soviet leadership, it looks like the geostrategical aspect of the situation was much more important than the political or the ideological one, even if we have also to take that into account. But what we call the realpolitik was always, of course, part of Soviet foreign policy, because, of course, in a world of competing powers, Soviet Union couldn't stay aside and not take some important decision in that way, and Baltic states were of strategical importance. That's one thing. Now, maybe the question is, what was the situation inside Baltic states at the moment when Soviet Union decided that Soviet leadership that it has to change and these countries have to be integrated to Soviet Union. First, we have to take into account that, as I told you, in the interwar period, when these states were independent, at the very beginning of the independence, population societies in this states were very divided about the question whether it's better to have a Soviet state or whether it is more important to have an independent state. And we have to take into account that especially Latvians, but it's also true for other Baltic nations, but especially Latvians, because Latvia is a maritime country with a quite important maritime policy and industry. The communists, the Bolsheviks, were quite strong. And even we can say that the Latvian communists were not only strong in Latvia, but were also very active in Russia, because in the Red Army you had Latvian units fighting during the whole Russian civil war. So we can say that at the very beginning of the decay of the Russian Empire, Estonian, Latvians and Lithuanians were not really decided, were divided if it's better to decide socialism inside a, let's say, new Russian Federation and later inside the Soviet Federation, or it's better to have national independence. And at the very beginning, it was not really clear. I mean, these societies were really, really divided about that issue. And this explains why these three countries, at least at the beginning of the interwar period, had rather a good relation with Soviet Union, because Soviet Union, Soviet Russia and later Soviet Union was quite popular inside those societies. But we have to take into account that there was a basic evolution during the whole interwar period due to the fact that the local nationalists, Latvian and Estonian or Lithuanian, took a very important decision. It means that, nationalism in Baltic states, in Baltic countries, developed mostly not against Russia historically, but nationalism was mostly in Latvia and Estonia anti-German, and in Lithuania it was rather anti-Polish, for very obvious reason, because the nationalists were they represented what we can say the local petit bourgeoisie and the local, peasantry, little owners, peasants, and they were advocating land reform against the big German landowners in Latvia and Estonia and the Polish landowners in Lithuania. So when they managed to have an independent state, and that was the basic difference between Poland and Baltic states, they realized the land reform. They took the land from German or Polish landowners and gave this land to the peasants. And this is a very important measure, because, of course, if we look for on long term, a little peasant property has no future inside capitalism, as we know, and the process of concentration of property will destroy little farms earlier or later. But if we thinking in short term, of course, the dream of peasant are always petit bourgeois like, and when they receive land, they are very happy, and they think that this situation can be definitive for centuries. They of course they do not understand economical process, global economical process, long-term processes, and they don't understand that earlier or later the land they received will be taken by capitalists. And we have, of course, to take into account that Baltic states had only 20 years of existence. So at the end of their existence in 1940, the mass of these people, the mass of peasants, it means the big majority of Baltic state society, were still very enthusiastic about independence, about national independence, because, of course, the independence bring them what they wanted. It means they had the land. Of course, at the beginning, at the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Russian Revolution, they could hesitate between Soviet power and independence, since the Bolsheviks and the nationalists were giving them, or were telling them, they will give them land. But as soon as national independence states gave them the land, they had what they wanted. And for the first years of independence, not only they had this land, but their children could quite easily be promoted in the state administration, because we have to take into account that Baltic states were earlier under the dominance of the Russian Empire, of course. And locally, the local elites were either German or Polish, and they disappeared as elite after the independence. So you had to create a new state administration out of children of peasants who occupied all administrative, military, police that had been created at that time. And you had a huge social promotion within those state administration, within those newly built and very quickly built state administration. So we must, of course, take into account the fact that in the 20s and in the 30s, a lot of people in Baltic states were quite happy with the new situation, or at least they were convinced that the new situation opened for them a huge possibilities they couldn't dream of before. Of course, what I say doesn't change the fact that the enthusiasm that the people, that peasants had, let's say at the beginning of the 20s, so it means just after the independence, under the system of, let's say, liberal democracy, because we can say that at the beginning of the 20s, these three Baltic states had something like a pluri-party liberal democracy, and it created at the very beginning some enthusiasm. But very quickly, the situation became worse not because of local decisions, but because of the general crisis of capitalism. In 1929, you had the whole world capitalist crisis, and this situation, of course, created a lot of problems all over Baltic states. But we can say that this situation happened even earlier, because in the mid 20s, in Lithuania, for example, we had already big social tensions, and this situation led Lithuania and later Latvia and Estonia toward dictatorship. But these dictatorships could seem, because it was the first time this society were not experienced. So at the beginning, this nationalist dictatorship could appear for a lot of peasants as the ideal way to preserve what they obtain. It means land, and to find work and career for their children in the new state administration built under this dictatorships governments. So what we can say is that when the Second World War burst, Baltic states society were still very unconscious of what is happening in the whole world. They still couldn't understand what means capitalism. They couldn't understand what means the global crisis of the 30s of the capitalist economy. They couldn't understand what means geostrategy and the fact that big powers fighting between themselves. It means Germany, England, and France on one side, and of course on the other side, Soviet Union trying to preserve its political system and its development policy. They still were not aware of all that situation, and they couldn't understand that Baltic states are so little state that they do not count on international level. In Moscow, people, political leaders were, of course, very conscious of the fact that Baltic state had a very strategical importance. But inside Baltic states, they had the difficulty. I mean, you must imagine a peasant which is more or less educated. I mean, when I say educated, I mean politically educated, that was promoted inside a state apparatus, had not the ideological background, the education, the political education, making him understand what are the balance of power in the whole world. And in this situation, you must understand that the Baltic state became key states for strategical reason at a moment where this society were still not politically educated, so to understand that the moment of, let's say, euphoria they had after the independence, when peasants received lands, were of course very short moment of happiness. But they were coming to an end. Anyway, they were coming to an end. But most Baltic nations couldn't understand that in this concrete situation where they find themselves in from the beginning of the Second World War, they had only basically two choices: stand on the side of Soviet Union or stand on the side of Nazi Germany. You had quite a lot of people there thinking that they can preserve a national real independence between Germany and Soviet Union. And of course it was completely impossible since it was a world war. It was not a local war. So we have to take that into account. The second thing is, as I told you, there was something like a dictatorship in all these states, and the communists were illegal. So quite a lot of communists were emigrated to Soviet Union or to other states. And locally, we can say that the Communist Party was very weakened by this dictatorship. So they were not really prepared in 1939 to rebuild the force they had 20 years earlier. Of course, the Soviet Union imposed on Baltic states in 1939 the relegalization of communist parties, but you cannot rebuild a party within a week. Or within months. It takes time, especially, as I told you, since a lot of the formerly, let's say, pro-Soviet part of the society began to change their mind during the last 20 years due to this, let's say, national euphoria created after the land reform. And this situation, of course, explain why, that's for sure. I mean, in 1940, I would say that, of course, the majority of Baltic state society were not thinking that they should promote communism. Because, of course, they were completely out of the track, I would say, of world evolution. But on the same time, Soviet Union had to take a strategical, very important decision concerning Baltic states, since these states were strategically of basic importance for Soviet Union. So Soviet Union had to repel, I would say, the German borders up to East Prussia, and had no time to, let's say, convince the mass of Baltic nations that communism is a good thing that has to be promoted. But for the moment, they had to change things immediately. And this is one aspect of the question. The second aspect of the question, and the Second World War was very important for that, is that up to the Second World War, Soviet Union was built from the very beginning on the base of the idea that Soviet Union was not a national state. Soviet Union, up to the Second World War, was considered by communists, and especially, of course, by Soviet communists, but not only, it was also the case of communists outside Soviet Union, that Soviet Union is not the fatherland of the nations belonging to Soviet Union, but Soviet Union is the fatherland of the working class of the whole world. Soviet Union was not a national state. It was an international state localized in former Russian Empire, but the idea was that the Soviet type of government is the ideal government for all people all over the world. We have to remember that in 1919 we had in Hungary, for example, the Hungarian Soviet Republic. In the same time we had in Bavaria the attempt to create the Bavarian Soviet Republic, and in the 20s under Mao Zedong in the Hunan province we had the Chinese Soviet Republic. So the idea that the Soviet let's say system has to be promoted was worldwide. So because of that, Soviet Union was implicitly developing the idea that any state, any region of the world, any country that is going towards socialism must join Soviet Union. And so it was not really possible to imagine another way. This changed during the Second World War. So, when we study, for example, not only the Baltic question, but if we study, for example, the Polish question, we see that during the Second World War, Polish communists, especially Polish communists in Moscow, were discussing how to create a Polish Soviet Republic inside Soviet Union. And it is very important to take into account that the Soviet leadership changed its opinion toward what is Soviet Union, especially during the Second World War, but I would say especially after having deal with the experience of what is the Soviet government inside former Eastern Poland and inside Baltic state. I would say, Soviet Union was a new state. It has to experience a lot of ideas and principles and structures, and after every experience to think about. When Soviet leadership decided that the Baltic states should be inside Soviet Union, of course it was because of geostrategical reason, for geostrategical objective reason, and we have to understand that whatever we think about those decisions, it was of course of basic importance, not for the fate of Baltic nations, but for the fate of the whole humanity, the whole humankind, and especially of course the fate of Soviet Union as a state. But it was impossible to imagine at that time within communists that a state going towards socialism cannot be part of Soviet Union. This idea will appear after the experience of what happened, especially in Eastern Poland, former Eastern Poland, and Baltic states. And it is important what I told you earlier, that the discussion of Polish communists after 1941 in Moscow, advocating what will be the Polish Soviet Republic within Soviet Union, was actually this idea was forgotten due to Stalin's pressures. It means Stalin understood, after the experience of what happened in Baltic states, after the experience of what happened in Moldavia, after the experience of what happened in former Eastern Poland, that to make a country join Soviet Union is not the solution, since national differences are too strong sometimes to create a common state of all nations going towards socialism. And that's why he developed, he and of course the Soviet leadership developed then step by step the idea of people's democracy for countries which are not let's say, traditionally linked with Russian society, with Russian historical experience, with Soviet political experience. And this explains why at the very end of the Second World War, of course, countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Korea, Yugoslavia, China, and so on, when they decided, they changed and decided to go communist way, created new socialist state, but were not integrated to Soviet Union. But of course, what I'm telling now is the situation of 1941, 1944, 1945. We have to go back to the situation of 1939 and 1940. Then, at that time, it was impossible among communists, Soviet communists or other communists, to imagine a socialist society that would not join Soviet Union. So, of course, because of that, when it appeared that the independent Baltic states were supposedly going away more or less pro-Soviet after the beginning of the Second World War, but in fact were let's say under the influence of German imperialism. That the security reason for Soviet Union pushed Soviet Union to decide that it cannot exist anymore a nationalist government in these three countries, and that you have to push communists to power. But as soon as you push communists into power in June 1940, you must, logically, with what I told you earlier, you must decide that these three countries must join Soviet Union, because it was unimaginable to think other way at that time. 2 or 3 years later, things changed, but at that time, it was not possible to think of that. We have always to think that socialism is a new idea, so it had to experience a lot of situation to take into account facts that are not obvious at the very beginning. And of course, because of very profound historical reason, Baltic nations were traditionally not under, let's say, Eastern Slavic Russian influence, but were rather, as I told you, under Western German, Polish, Catholic, Protestant influence. This is, of course, very important, because we have to take into account that, of course, Baltic nations were formerly, from the end of the 17th or 18th century, part of the Russian Empire. But in fact, they were not under real Russian influence, as I told you. They were, Latvia and Estonia was under German influence, because the local landowners were German, were German-speaking, German-oriented, and they had their culture toward West. And the same thing was in Lithuania with Poles. It means the Polish landowners in Lithuania were not looking to Russian culture, they were looking to the so-called Latin culture. And this is, of course, important, because the social structures built in Baltic nations were not at all linked with let's say, the traditional Russian culture. And this made, of course, history doesn't change in a second. And of course, the Soviet culture that was promoted in Soviet Union after the revolution was a new political culture, but it was a political culture that was coming from, let's say, Russian empire's root. Unfortunately for the communists, we have to take into account that whatever we think about the fascist Polish thinker Roman Dmowski, politically he is our enemy, ideologically he is our enemy, and of course there is no point about that, it's for sure. But anyway, we have to understand one thing, that in the interwar period, especially in the 20s, Dmowski studied in a much more intelligent way, in a much more clever way, events happening in Soviet Union than a lot of communists. I mean, if you look at the books and the analysis made by Dmowski at the very beginning of the 20s, when he's analyzing what is going on in Russia, what is going on in the Soviet Union, what is going on in the Soviet political, in the Soviet Communist Party, he was one of the first analysts in the world. He was one of the first analysts in the world to notice the fact that Stalin is representing the future of Soviet Union. From the very beginning of his analysis, he is anti-Trotsky. He looks at Trotsky as a cosmopolitan Jewish, because of course Dmowski is an anti-Semite. So for him, Trotsky is the bad guy, and Stalin is the good guy inside Soviet Union. And whatever we think about Dmowski, we must take into account that he took into account the fact that there is a new society emerging in Soviet Union, which is not only the result of the Russian Revolution, which is of course a basic event, but which is also a mixture between Russian Revolution, Russian communism, and the background of the old Russian society. And he developed the thesis. We can, of course, don't agree with him, but anyway, he developed in the 1920s the thesis that Stalin is the man that will Russify communists and may make communism in Soviet Union, in Russia, according to him, something that can be positive for Polish state. Dmowski was always advocating the idea that Poland has to be anti-communist and in the same time aligned with Soviet Union against German imperialism. And because he was thinking that communism is a very bad idea, he was a fascist, but in the same time, Russia is the ally of Poles against German imperialism, German bourgeoisie, and even against Hitler, because Hitler is the forefront of German bourgeois imperialism, which will crush the local Polish bourgeoisie as they can in the very beginning. So the idea of Dmowski was, of course, we can criticize it, and for a lot of aspects, Dmowski is a complete reactionary and, as I told you, fascist. So we have nothing to do with him. But we have to take into account that his analysis of Soviet society is not completely bad. I mean, there is a logic in it. And he understood one thing a lot of communists didn't, that in Soviet Union, we have a new society emerging, which is linked with the former history of Russia. And this former history has not to be taken as good or bad, but as a fact that will give special features to Soviet Union, and because of that, such society, which are traditionally most Western oriented, like Poland, like Baltic states, these societies cannot fit in Soviet Union and cannot fit inside a Soviet system. And that explains, of course, why he developed the theory that communism is a purely Russian idea, which, of course, we don't agree with it. But we have to take into account that already in the 80s, at the very beginning, in the 80s of the 19th century, Dmowski wrote an article in which he said that Russia is going toward communism because of the Tsarist policy, which leads Russia toward communism. And of course, what he defined as communism is not real communism according to Marxist point of view, but still there is something very intelligent within the Dmowski analysis that we have to take into account. I would say that unfortunately, Marxists in Eastern Europe, and especially Marxists in Poland, Baltic states, but to a certain extent also in Soviet Union, didn't pick out from Dmowski what is intelligent in his analysis, because of course, and they were right, Dmowski is basically a fascist. And of course he is an enemy, but still this enemy is not an idiot. and can be an intelligent enemy. And I would say it was one of the most intelligent enemy of Marxism. And sometimes he was more intelligent than a lot of Marxists, because the fact that you are Marxist doesn't make you always intelligent. You can be stupid Marxist. It exists, unfortunately. Marxism is a tool, but you have to know how to use it. But you can use it badly if you don't know what represents really the Marxist methodology. And this is very important, because the Baltic state, and I'm coming back to Baltic state, the Baltic states were states that were, as I told you, until the Russian Revolution, that were not really linked with Russia due to these German landowners in the north and Polish landowners in Lithuania. It means that the masses of Lithuanian, Latvians, Estonians, in their everyday life, over them, they had German or Poles. They had no Russian. They didn't know about Russia. They had no Russian functionaries. The situation changed basically during the First World War, because when the First World War began in 1914, the Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian peasants had to go to the Russian army, and then they discovered Russia. I mean, Russia, of course, Russian Empire, Russian Tsarism, and so on. And then you had two reactions. I mean, of course, it was not a logical reaction. It was let's say, instinct reaction. You have to take into account what a Lithuanian peasant taken out from his village, pushed inside the Russian army, will react. Will he react, as a lot of them did, in an anti-war movement, anti-imperialist movement, listening to a Bolshevik discourse? Some of them did and took part on the Bolshevik side. But the majority, let's imagine, the majority of Lithuanian, Latvians, or Estonians, they were not politically educated. They even didn't know the Russian language. So imagine a Lithuanian or a Latvian peasant, a young peasant, integrated in the Russian army in 1914, fighting for a war he doesn't understand, in a language he doesn't understand. He is completely panicked by war, by front situation. And his first reaction is to go toward people with whom he's able to talk. So he's looking for brothers who talk Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian, and it is, of course, the first stage of nationalism. And it's been much more easier for such a peasant in 1940 to go toward nationalism. I'm going with my brothers. I do understand what they are talking about. That I will listen to the Bolsheviks who are talking in Russian, a language I don't understand. So it means that, the most intelligent peasant could understand the Bolshevik propaganda, but the less educated ones, they couldn't even understand what was coming from the anti-militaristic, anti-imperialist propaganda of the Bolsheviks. And you have to take into account that these people were educated, I would say, in a very easy way toward nationalism. 20 years after, these people were bureaucrats inside Lithuania, in South Latvia, in South Estonia, and they had no interest to change the situation because they found a quite positive personal, individual situation. And in their situation, of course, between Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, they would rather prefer Nazi Germany for a very, very basic reason. It means that within Soviet Union and Communist Party, they had no future because of their opinion, because of their social backgrounds, because of their political experience during the last 20 years. But they could imagine, of course, it was not real, but they could imagine that on the German side they will have more opportunities, since they were already accustomed to the German culture, to the Western culture, much more than to the Russian one, and they were also knowing that the German, they respect local, they respect quote private property. So the land they received 20 years ago will not be taken by kolkhoz. And, they had still that petit bourgeois mentality, that a little owner is not disappearing within capitalism. So you have to take that into account. Soviet Union had no time to re-educate them in 1940. So Soviet Union has to introduce by force the Soviet Socialist Republic, knowing that, because it's obvious that the majority of Lithuanians, Latvian and Estonians are still linked with the idea of national independence. And at that time, as I told you, it was impossible for communists to imagine a socialist state not joining Soviet Union. And it is this experience that later will prevail inside Soviet leadership. I mean, Stalin, and not only Stalin, understood, based on this experience, that society which have another historical background than the Russian and let's say Russian accustomed societies of Ukraine, Belarus, Caucasus, and Central Asia, cannot ideologically imagine themselves within the frame of, let's say, Russian communism, and that you have to invent for them another blend, I would say, of communism, which was the so-called theories of people's democracies, which were created after the Second World War for newly liberated countries by the Red Army, and later, of course, the same happened in Asia with Korea and later China. But we have to take into account this experience. I mean, communists and Stalin are not God. They are people who experiment different things, and after the experimentation, they can understand what are the historical process. Just that in 1939, Soviet Union had no time to make different experimentation. They had to take the control of Baltic states, and fortunately they did, because if they wouldn't have, I mean, the German army would have been, at the very beginning of the Second World War, 80 kilometers from Leningrad. I mean, we have to take into account that fact. I mean, geostrategy is sometimes, in a war situation, much more important than ideology. It was of basic interest for Soviet strategy to take control of former Eastern Poland, Romanian borders, Baltic states, and Finnish borders. It was of basic importance. It was a question of life and death. And when you have no time to promote a long-term policy, at least you must promote a short-term policy which is guaranteeing the survival of your state. And it's, of course, the situation Soviet leadership had to deal with in 1939. I mean, we all know that Soviet Union tried during the whole interwar period to create a collective security situation in Europe to avoid war. But of course, nobody outside Soviet Union did really wanted the collective security to prevail because of inter-imperialist contradiction and because all imperialist countries hated socialism so strongly that they wanted first to destroy Soviet Union. So the peaceful policy of Soviet Union couldn't prevail. And in this situation, in 1939 in Poland and in 1940 in the Baltic state, Soviet Union has no other choice than to take this region inside Soviet Union, since it was impossible psychologically, I would say, and ideologically, for communist, Latvian, Polish communists, or Estonian communists to imagine a communist party leading a country which would not be part of Soviet Union. And on this way, we can say that, of course, as soon as the decision was taken that Baltic states should join Soviet Union, of course, you cannot imagine that this decision would have changed in 1944, in 1945, because it was impossible to recreate people's democracy in these states, since they were officially since they officially joined earlier Soviet Union. But still, if you look at the way the Soviet army managed the situation, you understand the change. In 1940, all the symbolics of the Baltic state disappeared completely. But when the Soviet army, the Red Army, liberated, for example, Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, in 1944, they entered the city under the pre-war Estonian flag. The pre-war independent Estonian flag. Of course, it didn't last long, but anyway, it shows that in 1944, Soviet leadership was aware that if you want to make Estonians or part of Estonian choose Soviet Union, you cannot use the red flag of Soviet Union. You must use a flag Estonian identify with, and it was the white, black, blue flag of pre-war Estonian independence. Of course, you can say it's a purely demagogical decision, but it's not the most important in what I'm telling, if it's demagogy or not. It is, of course, a proof that Soviet leadership took into account during the period 1940-1944 that the Baltic state nations had a consciousness which was basically different from the other Soviet nations, and it was even taken into account. For example, we have in 1945 the decision of the Potsdam Treaty, as you know, that the the Königsberg region would become the Russian Kaliningrad region. And logically, geographically speaking, if you look at the map, you would say that the former East Prussia should belong to the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. But at that time, at the head of the Soviet Socialist Republic, we had a very long, he lived a long time, we had the first secretary of the Communist Party, which is called Snieckus. And Snieckus refused to take Kaliningrad within the Lithuanian Republic. He explained especially he was very linked with Suslov in the political bureau of the Communist Party, that if Lithuanians could accept the fact that they belong to Soviet Union, you must guarantee that the Lithuanian Republic would be an ethnical Lithuanian Republic. If Kaliningrad belongs to Lithuania, it will be colonized by Russian settlers, and Lithuanian Republic will not be ethnically Lithuanians. So he negotiated with Moscow that Kaliningrad will belong to Russia and not to Lithuania. That Lithuanian Republic will be loyal to Soviet Union, but that Lithuanian Republic will be ethnically Lithuanian. It means that no Russian settlers inside the Republic, something like an autonomous ethnical Lithuanian region. So we can say that Sniečkus was partly nationalist and partly communist, but that's the reality. He was partly nationalist and partly communist because he was, I don't know what he really thought inside himself. I don't care about that. But he was a realistic. He knew that if you want Lithuanians to really join Soviet Union, you must guarantee that Lithuania will not be a Russified republic within Soviet Union, but a real national republic loyal to Soviet Union, but still completely Lithuanians. And that explains why Poles in Lithuania during the old Soviet times were really the Poles of Vilnius region were strongly opposed to the local government, the local Lithuanian Republic, Soviet Republic government, but very pro-Soviet and looking for links with Soviet Union, with Soviet Federation, because they felt inside the Lithuanian Republic as second-class citizens. And when Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, the Polish minority in Vilnius stayed on the side of Soviet Union, not on the side of Lithuanian independence, and not on the side of Polish government in Warsaw, because they felt much more Soviet-oriented than Polish or Lithuanian-oriented, even if they were Poles, ethnically speaking. Because of that strong Lithuanian nationalism that survived within Soviet Union. And now, if you go to Lithuania up to now, you will never find any attack of Lithuanian nationalists, anti-communists, against Sniečkus. Sniečkus for them is a patriot who managed to preserve the ethnical aspect of Lithuanian Republic within Soviet Union. Of course, and what I'm telling you is that, that's the result of history. And of course, we can criticize the compromises that the Soviet leadership did after the Second World War and later. But we have to take into account that from the very beginning, the situation of the Baltic states was, to a certain extent, very complicated, and that we have a basic contradiction, and it's not only in the Soviet case and in the case of the Russian Revolution. We have always a basic contradiction between short-term policies and long-term policies. For long-term policies, everything is clear. I mean, it is obvious that capitalism is in crisis, that capitalism will disappear, and that the only way to save humankind is socialism. Scientifically speaking, there is no doubt about that if you are really objective. But that's for the long term. The problem is how to manage with the short-term consciousness, which are, of course, not changing as quick as the economy, the capitalist economy, is changing. And that's the basic issues that Marxists have to deal with. And the Baltic state situation in 1940 is a very good example of this contradiction between long-term and short-term. And we can say that the Soviet leadership at that time, and Stalin especially, did take that into account, but it took a little bit time. I mean, the Stalin of 1944 was not the Stalin of 1940. He had also to take into account the result of the experience he promoted in Baltic states, and this explains why in 1942 or in 1943 he explained to Polish communists in Moscow that Poland will not be a Soviet republic. And it explains also why after the Second World War, when Bulgaria and even Yugoslavia asked to be part of Soviet Union as Soviet republic, Stalin said, no, you cannot be part of Soviet Union because you have another other local situation that make your country's people's democracy with a different road towards socialism than Soviet Union. Of course, I'm talking about the immediate post-war period, because very quickly, as you know, Tito will change his mind. But in 1945, he asked officially Yugoslavia to be a republic of Soviet Union. And Dimitrov did the same with Bulgaria. So, the idea that new socialist countries must not join Soviet Union is to a certain extent the result of the experience carried on in Baltic states in 1940. But without this experience, the decision, the evolution of Soviet Union wouldn't have happened. It was logical that this experience had to be carried on. Of course, it was not completely positive from the point of view of Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians, since quite a lot of them, deceived by the fact that their independence disappeared within Soviet Union, thought that the German would be better. And of course, it creates the fascist orientations in these states, which was very strong, much stronger than, let's say, in other German occupied countries. But still, of course, we have to take into account that not only communists, of course, were in the resistance movement in Baltic states against German occupation, but even in Lithuania, had also a social democrat resistance against German occupation. So little by little, you can say that this society began to understand that nationalism is not the solution. But of course, it was a minority. We must take into account the fact that in 1940, the majority of Baltic nations didn't want it to join Soviet Union, and that the referendum that was officially carried on then cannot be considered as truthful, since Soviet Union recognized it later, informally. But I mean, in fact, when you analyze Soviet documents in the 50s and 60s, they recognized that Soviet Union forced situation in Baltic state because of geostrategical reasons which were much more important for the human history than local, let's say, consciousness, backward consciousness of the people of these three countries. We must learn to understand history in a dialectical way, and it's very difficult to do.
Yesterday, I spoke with Professor Anila Cruaris.
Yes,
and she spoke without pause 1 hour 45 minutes.
I'm a little bit better. Only 1 hour.
No. You lose.
I lose. Okay, I lose. Okay, I lost. I thought you were greeting me because I was short.
No.
It better.
Was,
okay. Next
good.
time I will talk 3 hours.
Okay. like Fidel.
Yes, but I doubt I have his level of intelligence. But anyway.
So first question which I would like to ask, It's about the today historic political history of Lithuania,
Huh.
because it's very important to Polish people the date of 70 September. It is like a religion. All the
Yeah, of
time
course.
they speak about this that Poland was attacked by the Soviet Union, and because of that, if I am not mistaken, the 70 September now was considering in the all European Union like a day against totalitarianism or something like this, that the Polish proposed in the Parliament Union, something that in this day they condemn the communism, like a totalitarian society. 70 September.
Yeah.
So
But
so
it's not the point of view of Lithuania.
yes, and it is what they teach in the school
In
about
Lithuania,
this.
it's much more complicated because what they consider as their historical capital was liberated by Soviet Union, who gave it this capital to Lithuanian independent states, because Lithuania was not part of Soviet Union at that time, and and that's an important point of view that we have to take into account in Poland, and we don't want to take into account it in Poland. It means that when the Soviet Union gave Vilnius to Lithuania, the Poles there were much more oppressed by Lithuanians than they were supposed to be oppressed on the Soviet side. So when Lithuania joined, more or less a couple of months later, Soviet Union, Poles in Vilno or Vilnius were quite happy that a Slavic army is coming to defend them against the Lithuanian nationalists. That the first thing the Lithuanian did in Vilnius when they took the city from Soviet hands was to close the Polish university and to create a new university out of the Kaunas University. So, they closed every Polish institution and they forced Lithuanian schools. But when the Soviet Union came back in Vilnius, they reopened Polish schools along with Lithuanian schools. And this, of course, is not taught in Polish in Poland now. What was the point of view of local Poles between Lithuanian independence on one side and Soviet Union on the other side. It doesn't mean, of course, that the Poles were pro-communists in Soviet Union, in Soviet Lithuania in 1940, but between Lithuanian nationalism and Soviet Union, much of them prefer Soviet Union, and this explains why all over the Soviet history up to the end of Soviet Union, Poles in the Vilnius area were much more linked with Moscow than with the Vilnius government. And of course, that we have to take into account. The second information was a little bit different from Baltic state, but I will call you. I think it's important. Is Belarus decided this year, you know what is the situation between Poland and Belarus, that the 17th of September from now will be the national holiday of Belarusian reunification. So now it's a state holiday, official state holiday in Belarus. That's the result of the Polish government policies. They pushed Lukashenko to create a new holiday in his country, and that's the fact. And you will not find that in the Polish media because it's a shame for Poles. But anyway, the answer of Lukashenko is a very clever one. Because in fact, that's right. 17th of September, we can, from the Polish point of view, it can be described as a tragedy. The question was it a tragedy or not is open, but for a Belarusian point of view, it is the reunification of their country. And that's also a very objective situation. I mean, Belarus was divided in 1921 and was reunified after the 17th of September 1939. So for a Belarusian, what happened on this day is a national liberation moment. But it was not a holiday in Belarus, not to create tensions between Warsaw and Minsk, but now, since the Polish government is promoting an anti-Minsk, anti-Belarus policy, why Lukashenko would not take advantage of this? And he decided the 17th September 1939 will be an official holiday in Belarus.
Maybe next year or 2023, I will go to Belarus to make reportage.
It would be,
70 September.
it's a very interesting country. It would be very good, if a lot of Poles would really have the courage to travel to Belarus and not only to hear what the propaganda is telling. I mean, when people go to Belarus, and especially when Poles go to Belarus, they come back with a completely different point of view on political situation. Not only political situation in Belarus, but they understand much more clearly what is the general situation all over the world, and especially in Poland. So the best political re-education for Poles is to go to Belarus 2 weeks, 3 weeks, look around, go to coffee shop, talk with people, and it's a complete revolution in their mind. And when they come back. Because, Belarusians are not nationalists. They are not, when Poles go to Lithuania and talk to Lithuanians, in front of them, they have quite a lot of time Lithuanian nationalists. And, it creates some tensions, or in Ukraine, of course, especially in Western Ukraine. But when you go to Belarus, you see that Belarus, they are not anti-Polish. They like to talk with Poles. They have no nationalist, ethnocentrical way of looking at things. So it's very easy to talk with them and have open discussion with them. And then you discover, they are really open-minded people. They are really highly educated people. They are really healthy people, and the situation is not at all as it is described in the Western media, and especially in the Polish media. And then it makes people discover that a bunch of lies are told about this country. Whatever you think about Lukashenko as a man, I mean, you understand that, Belarusian society is a real society with quite a lot of very impressive economical, cultural realizations. Belarus is a tremendous country. It's a country that has to be discovered because it's partly post-Soviet, partly a market-oriented city, but mostly state economy, which is functioning quite well. And the opposition they like to talk about in Western world is a hipster middle class, upper middle class opposition, but the basic Belarusians are not at all linked with that opposition. It's very easy to take 100,000 people in Minsk against the government, but you have to think that Belarus Belarus, it's 10 million people, and those people don't take the street. I mean, they are more or less satisfied by Lukashenko. Maybe some of them are not satisfied by Lukashenko, but anyway, they understand that Belarus is I would say, the most socially progressive state in all Eastern Europe, and that's for sure. And the comparison for an average Belarusian of his life compared to Polish, Lithuanians, or Russian is in the advantage of Belarus, for sure. I mean, it's much easier to live in Minsk and have a future for your children than in Warsaw or in Moscow. That's that's a situation, and also there is no strong nationalism there. It's very tolerant society. You have all these national questions, these national identities, this disagreement between nations. I mean, when you talk to Belarusian, you have normal people. They look at you as you are, and not due to your nationality or the country you're coming for, or your Soviet ethnicity, and so on and so on. If you go to Belarus, I mean, they would say that Mickiewicz, Dostoevsky, and Chagall, they are our compatriots, because Chagall is a Jewish painter from Belarus. Dostoevsky is a Russian writer from Belarus, and Mickiewicz is a Polish writer from Belarus. And what is important for them is that they're from Belarus. It's not that they are Polish, writing in Polish, in Yiddish, or in Russian. For them, there is no point. I mean, this question is not a question. They call that zemliak, zemliaki. It means people from my land. And I would like this point of view developed in Poland or in Lithuania. People from my land, not people from my ethnicity. Or from my religion, or from my identity. No, people from my land. My neighbor is my neighbor, whatever his origin is, and that would be great.
Okay, so it's one more question about the Belarus. Because today I suppose that most of the Belarusian which we can find in Warsaw or in Vilnius, they are, if they are politically active, they are against the government in Belarus. So I would like to ask you about the Russian minority in Baltic states in the time of before Second World War.
Yes.
If this Russian minority was pro-Soviet, or they are like Chikhanouska and Protasiewicz?
No, it's different depending on the three countries. In Latvia, because it was an industrial country already at the time of Russian Empire, of the end of the Russian Empire, you had very strong working class consciousness among big cities workers, where you had quite a lot of Latvians and non-Latvians, and especially Russians. And of course, these people were rather left-oriented. Part of them were communist oriented. But of course, on the other side, you had also Russian people there, which were linked with the white Russians, because of course, former Russian government on these areas, or because they fled Soviet Union during the Civil War. So you had two, let's say, Russian minority there. The pro-Soviet ones, more or less pro-Soviet ones, and the anti-Soviet ones. And of course, you had that before the war, and during the Second World War, some of them collaborated even with Germans against Soviet Union and against Soviet army. So I would say that the Russian minority in Baltic states was not at all monolithical. It depends with whom you deal with. Of course, what I told you is mostly Latvia, where you had a strong working class. It was less the case in Estonia and especially Lithuania, which were much more rural countries, and where the Russian minority were much more, much less important, and much more conservative. But of course, it's not the same situation after the Second World War, when Soviet people from all Soviet Union came to Baltic states because of the industrialization of Baltic states. Because we have also to take into account that even if Baltic states were not really happy at the beginning of Soviet time, Baltic states became the richest republic within Soviet Union later. And the level of life in Riga, in Vilnius, in Tallinn, was superior to the level of life of average Soviet Union. So, I would say Baltic nation discovered after the new independence they get in 1991 that they lost the Soviet market. And up to now, it's the tragedy of these states. I mean, they lost the Russian market, and the situation they have now is quite tragical, because the level of emigration in Baltic states is much more important than in Poland or even Romania. And in the future, the demographical future of such state like Latvia is under, we have to think about it. Some people say Latvia will not survive because it has already less than 2 million people left in the country, and that the new independence is not a success story. But of course, European Union will never recognize this fact. But the fact is that the Baltic independence is not an economical success story now.
I can say that my son is going to crash with one baby, which the mother is from Latvia and father is from French, and she speak with him. And she has also the older son,
Yeah.
and he can't speak Latvian. He speak French. And she tried to speak with him in Latvian, but he answer on French language. But now they go to other cities, so it's no longer.
Did you talk with her about what she's thinking about Soviet Union and new Latvia, or
no. One time I saw her in the how to say Plac Zabaw.
Yeah, in the kindergarten. I think
kindergarten, and I ask in Russian if she understands Russian. Yes, she speak correctly Russian, but with when she spoke with her children, it was not Russian. I suppose that it was Latvian. Yes. Okay, so now I would like to ask you about because all the time I compare this situation with Baltic states to Poland. Because,
yes.
In Poland, one of part of this religion of the Soviet occupation is speaking about the Soviet crimes. All the times they
Oh, yeah,
speak
yeah.
that the Poles was
Yeah.
go to Siberia, and also the
Well, yeah.
cutting, etc.
Yeah.
Uh, is there are now I don't know, I don't want to say I use these crimes in the quotation.
Yeah. Yeah, 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 I understand. Yeah.
Uh, is there are crimes which the Baltic states accuse the Soviet Union?
Oh, yeah, it's much worse than in Poland. I mean, in Baltic states, you have entire museums about that story, about what they call the two occupations, the Soviet one and the German one. And if you look really in those museums, you will find that the so-called two occupation is more oriented anti-Soviet than anti-Nazi. Because they explained that the people who collaborated with the Nazi, it was because Soviet Union was so bad that they thought that Nazi was better, and so on and so on. So you have a situation much worse than in Poland, because at least in Poland, it is clear that the Nazi occupation was a horror, and it's impossible to tell Poles that a Soviet army was worse than the German Nazi army. At least this is a fact that you cannot change in Poland, because every Pole knows what the Nazis did, and they know that at least the Soviets were not really for them always positive, but at least they liberated them from mass killings and so on and so on. But in the Baltic states, the legend that the Soviets are worst is promoted almost systematically. You have SS, former SS divisions, which are hailed up to this day. You have monuments to them and so on, especially in Latvia. What would be completely impossible in Poland, the Polish police cooperating with the German it's impossible to imagine in Poland a monument to the Polish police. The German, the under occupation Polish, but in Latvia you have monument to the SS Letland or
Bruno, we have the monuments of the Brigada Świętokrzyska in Poland.
Yes, but still, I don't want to, to defend that, but theoretically, when they talk about the Brigada Świętokrzyska, they are telling, they didn't really collaborate with the Nazi and so on. They are trying to show it's not exactly the case. But in Baltic states, there is no problem. I mean, it's official SS divisions, and they have monuments. It's official SS. At least the Brigada Świętokrzyska were not SS, formally, There is still a difference. I mean, the Polish anti-communist propaganda cannot really, cope with this without problem. But in Baltic state, there is no problem. I mean, Soviets are the bad guys, and German are, not really good ones, but still you can behave with them. And you had people which were in the resistance movement during the German occupation, which were put in jail after 1991 in Latvia. It's like if it's like Polish resistance movement would have been put in jail after 1989 in Poland. It's impossible to imagine. But in Latvia, it was the case. I mean, you had quite a lot of people jailed because they killed German soldiers or Jews even. I mean, they killed German soldiers who killed Jews. and they were put in jail as murderers because they killed German soldiers or local collaborators of Germany killing Jews or resistance movement. In Poland, it would be unimaginable, this situation. So the Baltic states are in more or less in the same situation as Western Ukraine. It was more or less the same type of propaganda you have.
But I saw one time that demonstration in Riga, I suppose.
Yeah.
The old guy who were a member of
Yes.
of this.
Every year. Every
Yes, yes,
year.
yes, yes. But my question is, why they survive in the time of Soviet Union?
That's the question. That's another question. I mean, it's another. You know, I would say that Soviet repression after the Second World War was relatively too tolerant. Because no, yeah, that's right. You know, all the story about the Gulag and so on doesn't take into account the fact that Soviet NKVD after the Second World War was a little bit too tolerant toward fascists because they didn't wanted to create new tensions. So they accepted to not talk about that and not repress all of them. Some of them were repressed, but it was not a massive repression. And I would say that, when we talk, but it's another question, when we talk about so-called Stalinism, if there is a critic, I would say, about Stalinism, is not that they created Gulag, but that they didn't put in Gulag the ones that should have been put there. That's
Yes,
the point.
after this, what you say now, my respect for Comrade Stalin is a little smaller.
But you have, politics is compromise. And sometimes you must understand some compromises, but on the long term, sometimes you realize that the compromise was positive and sometimes that the compromise was not positive.
Yes, but
we're not
if
in
we
this
compare,
situation, so it's difficult to know what we would have do then.
yes, but if we compare this situation with Poland, that in Poland there were some people from Armia Krajowa which were arrested, and these people never collaborated with Nazism.
Yeah,
but they were arrested, and in the same time the member of SS.
You're right. I know, but because we have to think about that. Soviet Union was not a monolithic country, and the policy carried on in Latvia, in Lithuania, in Belarus, in Russia, in Georgia was not the same. Because you had local authorities, and the local authorities were not already. We have the vision of Soviet Union as a monolithic, centralistic state, as the Western propaganda developed. But Soviet Union was a federation, and we have to take that into account. And Khrushchev in Ukraine was not carrying the same policy. Especially toward nationalists, as let's say his comrade in Belarus. Of course, in Belarus, the policy carried on after the Second World War, I would say, was much more communist in an internationalistic interpretation than in Ukraine, for example. And the Belarus communist policy was not a nationalistic one. Khrushchev, he was a little bit tolerating nationalism, not even concerning the Nazi question or Nazi collaborators, but for example, he asked Soviet Union to claim the Helm region of Poland. And Stalin refused to ask Poland for the Helm region, and the idea Helm should belong to Soviet Union was a typically Ukrainian nationalist claim. That had to be refused in Moscow because Kiev asked for this region.
Okay, there is one thing.
We have to finish because I have another.
Okay. So my last question. There is one thing which I didn't understand, because firstly you said that there are many Latvian Bolsheviks, but after you said that many Latvians didn't speak Russian and it was other culture. So
yeah, the Bolshevik was rather the most educated before the revolution.
Yes, but this Bolshevik, it was Russian who lived in Latvia, or it was
partly Latvians. I mean, you had real Latvians who took side of on the Bolshevik in Latvia and in Russia, because as I told you, they were put in the Russian army. So when the revolution began in Russia, a lot of Latvians were not in Latvia at that moment, but in the Russian army somewhere in the in the front line against Germans, and they created in Russia, for example, the Red Latvian Division, which fought on the side of the Russian Revolution during the Civil War. Especially, Latvian killed the Tsar, the Nicholas Tsar was killed by Latvian army within the Russian army. And because so you had a lot of Latvian of ethnical Latvian in Soviet Union. Some of them came back to Latvia after the war, and some stayed in Soviet Union. And that's the other question. The same with Poland. Quite a lot of communists never came back to their country after the First World War, but stayed in Soviet Union. And that was a part of the reason why communists were so weak, because the best ones were in Soviet Union. Marchlewski, Dzierżyński, and so on for Poland, but you have the same with Latvia, for example, Pelce, which was one of the last member of the Soviet Communist Party political bureau member. He was one of the companions of Lenin. He did his career in Soviet Union, not in Latvia.
Okay, thank you, Bruno. I don't want to bother. So
you don't bother, but I have to.
Yes.
Political reunion now.
Okay. So it is good political job from one reunion to other.
That's a reunion. It's not. Video anyway. Okay.
So bye.
Bye.